So I get the sense that there are people who are going to be angry at this movie for being misleadingly advertised, but like also people who are going to be angry that it's not being misleadingly advertised enough, which is kind of an interesting problem to have. Speaking only for myself, I kind of get either version of that, but I also think the movie is really good and I think people should just go see it. Anyway, the very loose pitch here is that this is Paul Thomas Anderson once again doing a this time very loose variation on a book from Thomas Pynchon. In this case, his divisive 1990 effort Vineland, but in a completely different spirit, tone, and approach to the material from his earlier Pynchon take Inherent Vice. That one was a lot closer, trying to get the author's singular mix of brainy, postmodern genre mixing absurdist thriller conspiracy fiction on screen as something like a coherent cinematic narrative in its originally intended vibe and setting, whereas One Battle After Another takes the broadest possible outline of Vineland's themes, characters, and afterlife of the failed 60s and the about-to-collapse 80s aesthetic headspace and replants it in the immediate contemporary now while also stripping the Pynchonian surrealism down to raw realistic humanity for its characters and their situations, as though recognizing that both the revolutionaries and fascists of actual contemporary America are just absurd enough on their own, and the conceit of watching relatably normal people crash against their various madnesses is alarming enough to no longer require much more narrative embellishment. Which brings me back to those two expectant flavors of mismarketing. The film's mass media advertising, at least here in the United States, is selling essentially the piece as a kind of left-of-center spin on the Taken franchise, or maybe a less funny version of the Nobody movies, with Leonardo DiCaprio now wearing his 50 years of age visibly as a system fighter, machine rager against-her, political militant protest guy type of the early 2000s Gen X elder millennial model who has to get his semi-retired revolutionary underground fight the powers back in gear to rescue his daughter, who's being hunted by a full-scale military kill squad commanded by Sean Penn's racist psychopath military man Steve Lockjaw, who has a dark vendetta against the family and her specifically, and is willing and able to use all the darkest tools of Trump-era America's creeping police state fascism to their full extent in order to carry it out. That's a pretty strong pitch, a shoot the bad guys, save the girl power fantasy for the righteous blue sky meme set, and it does more or less describe the plot and setup of the movie pretty accurately. DiCaprio's ghetto Pat Calhoun, aka Bob Ferguson, is a former violent revolutionary who's been off the grid raising his daughter by another now missing in action revolutionary, Charlene, played by Chase Infinity, as a single dad for 16 years when suddenly their arch nemesis shows up, and so he has to get back in the mix, save the kid, and put unfinished business to rest, since the revolution Bob was fighting in the first place was all about resisting military-industrial fascism, fighting right-wing nationalism, and protecting immigrants back in the 2000s, and those problems have only gotten worse with Penn's Lockjaw now right in the thick of it. It's not a subtle movie in its topicality or politics. But the central gimmick for DiCaprio as protagonist is that while he may at one point have been a valuable asset to his revolution as a younger man, certainly has his heart in the right place in his political priorities and is relentless and driven as all the other post-Taken hero dads in his commitment to find and protect his child no matter the cost. His ambition significantly outruns his actual ability. As it turns out, One Battle After Another isn't necessarily a comedy, but it's close to being a serious version of all those What If Taken but with a normal dad comedy skits from when those movies were new, or maybe just a reverse version of Nobody, as in instead of asking what if a normal boring loser dad was secretly an omnicompetent killing machine super soldier and thus the bad guys who fucked with him are so unbelievably screwed now, the running gag here is that the situation demanded and expected of DiCaprio's Bob, or Ghetto Pat, or whoever he is or was, relates back to his history as a somewhat mythologized war hero of radical revolutionary rebellion, and to whatever degree his militant days were legit, he's now spent the last decade and a half turning into definitely not that guy, and is now just an ordinary schlubby loser single dad in his 50s who pounds too much beers, gets high too much, and definitely does not remember any of his revolutionary militant action training, passwords, coordinate getting, call signs, etc., and is way out of shape. I mean, you guys, he's totally still coming to hunt down the bad guys, save the girl, nothing will stop him, but like, he's gonna have to stop off and borrow a gun from her karate instructor first, but then they'd better watch out. He's kind of that guy, which is a funny feeling touch in what's otherwise still a very tense, frequently even nerve-wracking sort of action chase kidnapping movie framed against the background of bigger, unfolding political cultural breakdown. But I also get the sense that there's an audience that knows this is a Pynchon Vineland riff, albeit admitted up front a loose one, and will be expecting it to be even more silly about how ill-suited its hero is to, heroism, and maybe come away a little disappointed that ultimately this really really is a shockingly straightforward, dumpy white guy does his best action dad edition movie, where the bigger thematic subtext on hand, all about the much more important and far-reaching fights against the government, police state, and not-so-shadowy forces behind the scenes that Bob keeps leaping over, under, around, and through on his quest, nonetheless doesn't get framed as somehow not related to the main protagonist's narrative. The level of we're in this together tightrope walking is impressive, and the film clearly trusts the audience to understand the nobility in the various characters who put themselves on the line to help Bob and Charlene, and also to roll their eyes at Bob's lack of recognition that he's not really the main character of reality, even as we empathize with the realistic gag of, no, of course, in reality a normal person doesn't remember spy movie call signs and password bullshit, while still rooting for him to get it right and succeed because he's the good guy and he is basically doing his best. And further nice two-step credit to Chase Infinity as Charlene, managing the difficult straddling of coming off as both a sharper, more prepared than most kids teenager, and still, you know, just a fucking teenager, behaving like a teenager would in this situation, while even still a pretty well-prepared one. But it is likely to be surprising if you go in expecting something more absurd or satirical in the vein of an Inherent Vice, or even Anderson's other big, extravagant, boy, world sure is crazy, huh, movies, to realize that apart from the digressions at the expense of how truly insane Lockjaw is, you know, what his motivations are, and how endearingly out-of-depth the ostensible hero is, this is a mostly serious, grounded, humanistic story about real-feeling people surviving an ungrounded situation in inhuman times, which is not really what you expect someone to do with this kind of material, and thus why I suspect they aren't even bothering to sell it as an adaptation. But I think it really works. And I'll be really interested to see what people actually think of this one, because I understand why sometimes you have to sell a slightly different movie than the real thing just to get asses in seats and surprise people, but I also feel like it's a normal, straightforward, easy enough to understand solid premise that just being honest about the main thrust of it would have been a better sell in this case than trying to dance around it. Another action dad movie, but what if this time it's a normal loser guy who still has to do the thing even though he's kind of a mess and stoned and 2 or 3 beers deep the whole time? To me, sounds more like a movie people would go to see just because it's new. Anyway, it seriously cooks when it gets going, feels very of the moment in its topicality, but also not preachy or whiny about it. I'm going to say 9 out of 10. I felt really good about this one. Check it out.